My name is Colin Whaley, and this is a presentation about learning how to learn, a guide for memorization-based courses featuring Anki. This PowerPoint can be found on my website at colinwhaley.com. A brief preamble. This method uses scientifically validated principles to help you remember content through the use of active recall and spaced repetition. This presentation is primarily aimed at undergraduate life sciences or pre-medical students who are looking to improve their study strategies. Examples are provided from biology, but this can also be used with other content-heavy subjects, like psychology. This is not suited for math-based courses or those that require substantial problem solving, like chemistry or physics. I make no guarantees about the effectiveness of this system for you, but it has worked for me and many others who have followed these methods closely. A lot of the content from this PowerPoint comes from this book, Learning Medicine. It was written by physicians and medical students for other medical students. However, it can also be used by pre-medical students as well. It is where I learned all of these techniques, and I very strongly recommend it, and I do believe it is appropriate for undergraduate students as well. The required software to use this method is called Anki. It can be found at this URL here, and I expressly recommend you do not use any other version, specifically not this application called Anki app. If you see this logo that has just appeared at the bottom, do not use this application. A note on Quizlet, an application that many students use to make and study flashcards. Quizlet is much more user-friendly than Anki, but Anki is much more featureful. Quizlet, when used with its default settings, lacks the spaced repetition that Anki does. I make absolutely no claims on the efficacy of Quizlet, and I expressly don't recommend it. It is not a replacement for Anki. A brief overview of learning and memory theory. This is called the forgetting curve. It describes the percentage of information you'll recall after first encountering it as a function of days after learning. You'll notice that the recall of learned information decreases rapidly as time goes on. Additionally, practice will allow you to improve your recall of this content substantially. Practicing this recall will allow you to retain content for much longer. Notice, you need to see information less frequently as a function of time in order to learn the content. This method may realistically only take at most 2 to 3 hours per day. It requires dedication and being on top of your studies. However, I do believe this is doable even when things get busy. Finally, this method can also be used for cramming when time is short, and I will show you the settings to use in order to effectively cram for your examinations. This is the testing effect, and you can see between students who used active testing on the left and those who passively studied on the right, the percentage of correct answers to questions was substantially larger in those who actively recalled information versus just passively reading it. Additionally, Anki uses spaced repetition algorithms to show you incorrectly answered cards again, and if necessary, again and again, in order to ensure that you have mastered the content. How can you implement Anki? Instead of making notes listing reams of facts or passively highlighting important phrases from your textbook or lecture slides or notes that you've made, reform this into you asking questions based off of the content you are given. Realistically, I believe that most students can predict a lot of the possible questions on their examinations if they approach it from a different angle. That is to say, when you're reading over the textbook or PowerPoint slides or lecture notes, you are given all of the answers to possible midterm questions in front of you. Your goal is then to put that in a form that allows you to easily memorize it and store it for recall, which is what Anki is very helpful with. This really does necessitate a fundamental change in one's study methods, and this occurs in 2 stages, which I will show you here in practice. You'll be given sources. Most professors and lecturers will provide PowerPoint slides on your e-learning portal, and there's sometimes textbooks for courses as well. The first phase of learning is the capture phase, and is when you take information from professors' PowerPoints and textbooks and import them into Anki. One of the very important ways to expedite and make your studying efficient is to limit the scope of content you capture as much as possible. If the professor says very early on that they only test content from their PowerPoint slides, then only use the PowerPoint slides as your primary source of content for your Anki cards. You are, of course, welcome to use textbooks to clarify concepts, but if there are concepts presented in the textbooks which are not in the PowerPoint, do not add those textbooks. If readings are mandatory, start with the PowerPoint and incorporate the PowerPoint's contents into Anki, then supplement it with the textbook. An idea being that if content is both in the PowerPoint and in the textbook, it is likely to be very important, and if the professor went out of their way to include it in their PowerPoint, it is very likely important content. From this, we have now captured all of the source material into Anki as effective flashcards. Your second role is now to retrieve that content in the learning and review stage using Anki. Briefly, on learning and reviewing, the learning happens at the recall stage, not at the capture stage. This is a very common error students make. As you're going along making flashcards, there's no expectation that you remember any of that content. Additionally, I sometimes get a little freaked out as I'm going about making my flashcards, wondering how I'm going to remember all of that information. Remember that Anki will help you learn that information after. There's no need to get anxious. Trust in the method, it will serve you well. Your goal when you are making your flashcards is getting all of the important content into a format you can effectively learn it in. Memorization can come after. The main idea is that you capture every piece of information into a card. All of the PowerPoint slides given here are from instructor PowerPoints for the textbook Bioinquiry, Making Connections in Biology. Here, we're considering this PowerPoint slide about cytoskeletal components. I'm going to be using highlighting to indicate different pieces of information on this slide. Do not highlight when making your questions. Exclusively input the content into Anki. It's not important that you do any additional annotations to your lecture slides. For example, if you want to capture, and what you should capture firstly, is a question based off of the composition of cytoskeletal components. So for example, what is the cytoskeleton comprised of? The answer being long, thin protein filaments. Additionally, you'll want to capture which sizes those come in. And the final question here is the roles that the cytoskeleton plays in cells. You'll notice that I have bunched all three of those points into one card, but on my question, I've indicated the number of roles that I should be explaining. Please note that you can copy and paste if you're given material in a format where you're able to into Anki, which allows you to save time from typing everything out. Remember, typing things out is not an effective way of learning them. Active recall is. If you're able to copy and paste from PowerPoint slides, please do so. It will save you time. Not all questions are created equal, and I certainly have made many bizarre or difficult to understand Anki cards in my day. So for example, this slide, for which the title is, "What is the nature of cell membranes?" the question could very easily be made as to, what is the nature of cell membranes for your Anki card? However, this is a very bad question. What a cell membrane is composed of is phospholipids, cholesterol, and proteins, but it's not clear that this is the answer being asked based on the question. Instead, a much better question would be, what are cell membranes comprised of? Note that I'm still testing the exact same content, I'm just making the question itself less vague. Definitions are important to test yourself on as well. So for example, if you're given the term phospholipid and you don't know what it is or what it's comprised of, it's important that you make a card based off of that. You can test definitions in a couple of ways. I prefer making myself define the word or the term. Some classes and some professors use clicker questions to get class attendance and to quiz you on course content. If you are allowed, always take pictures of these questions as quickly as you can and make note of the answer. Copy them exactly as is into an Anki card, of course making sure you note the answer in the card. Professors absolutely love putting some of these questions on exams. However, if you encounter the question on the exam, make sure to read the question carefully, as some professors like to make subtle changes to these questions. My source for all of this content is that I've been a TA for 8 terms total, and I have observed professors doing all of these things. We'll now consider a more complex process, the function of the sodium-potassium pump. This slide looks very intimidating. It's a cycle, it's a process, there are multiple phases, and there are multiple molecules involved. What's important is that you need to pick out the details you need to know and the overall concepts and capture those as cards. For example, it's important to capture which ions the sodium-potassium pump moves, the energy source for the sodium-potassium pump, and the order of actions for the sodium-potassium pump as well, and where it's located. Notice, I test the same piece of information here multiple times, what ions are moved, and I test the entire cycle. This card may take you multiple tries, and it likely will, but as you go about reciting the process, eventually you will memorize it. I'll briefly go over use of the application Anki itself. When you open the application, which is available for macOS, Windows, Android, by an external developer, and iOS, which is a paid application, you're then presented with this interface here. When you start, you'll only have a default deck. I also have a deck for a kinesiology course I took. If you want to add to an existing deck, click that, or if you want to make a new one, click the Create Deck button. Click on Add, and enter the question on the front of the card, and the answer on the back of the card. Then click Add. For example, what is the main function of the heart with respect to mechanical activity? The answer is to be an efficient and coordinated pump. You can then hit Control-Enter on Windows or Command-Enter or Return on Mac in order to add that card to your deck and be presented with a new blank card. You'll then want to repeat this process. I usually get between 250 and 350 cards per midterm, my max being just over 500, and this of course depends on how many midterm examinations a course has. I as well separate my decks by midterm, so I typically have 2 to 3 decks per class. And I have found that this process works very, very well. Like making notes, you're putting the content into your own words, with the added bonus of making material you can use to test yourself, also for the final exam coming later as well. It's a very holistic, integrated process of allowing you to learn efficiently. Remember that the important part is the testing phase, not the flashcard creation phase. So if you find someone else's flashcards, that's okay. But most folks do find that they like to organize the information themselves in some way before. Can you cram using Anki? Yes, and I have used this to success. I really only go through a deck about once per test or midterm, but you can do it a couple of times. My max is about 2. In order to do this, assuming that, for example, you've finished making your deck the day before the midterm and you want to study it, you can click Custom Study, increase to today's new card limit, note the number of new cards in the deck, and then type in that number or a higher number into that the number entry spot. To review more cards, so for example, you've reviewed the deck once and you want to do it a second time, you can increase today's review card limit and note the number of total cards in the deck and make this number equal that. Once you're ready to study, click Study Now. You'll be presented with your first card. Say the answer out loud or in your head. If you don't know, that's okay. Click Show Answer or hit the spacebar. The answer will then be presented, and you'll have a choice. If the answer came very easily to you, click Easy. You won't see that card again, however. So what I typically do, even if I was quite confident with my answer, is I will hit Good the first time I see a card. This will ensure I see it one more time to verify my knowledge. If you were very greatly struggling on a card or you had no idea, make sure that you make note of what the answer is and click again. You should aim to get through around 50 to 100 cards per hour or maybe more, but this means actually totally finishing them and learning them. This is doable. Trust that as you are recalling more and more, you are getting to know the content better. In conclusion, Anki makes studying very efficient and easy. Trust in the science behind Anki. Don't psych yourself out. I wish you the best of luck. These are the sources for this presentation, and I thank you very much for your time.